Good afternoon and welcome everybody to Forum Friday with the Wisconsin Policy Forum. It's now just a bit after 12:30, but we're going to give just a minute or two more to ensure that everybody can log on and join us for today's event. So just stay tuned and we're going to get this program underway in just a few minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Sommerhauser, Communications Director and Researcher at the Wisconsin Policy Forum. Welcome to another installment of our virtual policy discussion series, Forum Friday. We aim to shed light on important issues covered in our recent research, and we do so by bringing in guests with different perspectives and engaging our audience through Q&A. These events have proven popular during the pandemic, and we expect to hold them periodically on Fridays going forward. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Forum, we're a statewide, nonpartisan, independent policy research organization with offices in Milwaukee and Madison. We're supported by hundreds of corporations, nonprofits, local governments, school districts, and individuals who value data-driven decision-making and civil policy discussion. So, if you're tired of mind-numbing political ads and cable news that puts conflict before a substance, but value thoughtful, in-depth conversation about issues that matter to our communities and to our state, then welcome. You're in the right place. Today's Forum Friday explores the 2021 budgets for the city of Milwaukee and the city of Madison. These were the focus of our recent annual budget briefs that examine these municipal budgets in depth each year. We found that the pandemic has erected some serious fiscal hurdles for those communities, but even more importantly, that there are structural challenges that predated COVID-19 that are affecting this budget and will only become more daunting in coming years. Today's format will be as follows. We'll begin with Forum President Rob Henkin and Research Director Jason Stein to unpack their research. Then I'll introduce our two special guests to offer their thoughts. And finally, we'll conclude with an audience Q&A. That won't happen until the end of the program, but you can submit your questions right now or at any time during the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we encourage you to get those questions in sooner rather than later, as it's helpful to have some of them ready and waiting in the queue as soon as we begin the Q&A. So with that, let's get our event started. I'm pleased to introduce Forum President Rob Henkin and the Forum's Research Director, Jason Stein. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here.
All right. So our first question is going to be for Rob Henkin. You recently authored our annual brief on the city of Milwaukee's 2021 budget. How would you briefly summarize what our viewers need to understand most about this budget?
Well, Mark, first of all, it's hard to be brief when we're talking about a $1.6 billion budget. And actually, the mayor's proposed budget summary is about 240 pages. But I will try to be brief, and let me just do that by focusing on three items. First of all, we're going to pop up a slide here. What this slide is showing us, and it is the proposed $640 million general city purpose budget. And so this is the budget that essentially provides the funding for all of the city departments with which so many of our viewers are familiar, from police to fire to public health to libraries, et cetera. And what's important here are two things. Number one, we can see that the property tax levy that is available for general city purposes in the 2021 proposed budget is actually lower than the property tax that was available in 2020. So that is a problem in terms of the impact that it has on city departments. And the overall levy goes up, but the reason that the levy available for general city purposes goes down is because there's a need in 2021 to actually direct an additional $9.9 million of that levy to debt service. A second point is that the intergovernmental revenue, as you can see, which is the largest source of revenue in the general city purposes budget, is flat. And that's something that has been going on for decades. So what does all of that mean? Let's go to the next slide. What we can see is, well, first of all, it means that most departments need to somehow absorb their costs to continue, despite the fact that the revenue is lower in the general city purposes budget. And in particular, for next year, the city's largest department, the Milwaukee Police Department, has to suffer a proposed cut of about 120 police officers. Nevertheless, however, as you can see from this slide, MPD still would comprise about 46% of total departmental spending. And what is really remarkable about this is that overall, despite the loss of these 120 positions, the MPD budget shrinks by only about $400,000. And that's because of rising salary and fringe benefit costs for the remaining staff. Finally, my third point, a very alarming takeaway from the proposed budget is the extent to which the city's reserves have been depleted and the impact that has on departmental operations. This slide shows that until recently, the city was able to use sizable annual withdrawals from the tax stabilization fund to help avert departmental cuts. But that ability quite simply no longer exists at the very time it's needed most. In fact, while the TSF withdrawal was $28 million just 4 years ago, it's down to $7 million in the proposed budget.
Interesting. And Rob, you found that Mayor Barrett's proposed budget, to a greater extent than other recent budgets, seeks to avoid even deeper service cuts with revenue increases from new or increased fees that would affect most Milwaukee residents and businesses. Can you describe some of those for us?
Yes, Mark. So I mentioned the sharp cut in Milwaukee Police Department positions. There's also the elimination of one fire station. But for the most part, other departments are avoiding major pain in the 2021 budget. And that's because indeed the mayor is turning to increased fees, far more than he has in the past several budgets. That includes a new street lighting fee that will cost the average residential property owner about $50 per year, and a $10 increase in the vehicle registration fee. And those and other fee increases also come on top of a 2.8% increase in the property tax levy. And of course, all of these increases come amid an economic recession, which is typically the last time that you want to be increasing taxes and fees. But again, because of some of these revenue challenges, the mayor had little choice but to do so if he wanted to preserve departmental spending for the most part.
Well, let's turn now for a moment to Jason Stein. We're going to discuss his annual brief on the City of Madison's 2021 budget. And Jason, for your part, what are the key points or points that our viewers need to understand about the Madison City budget?
Thanks to all of you and to Presidents Johnson and Carter for setting aside our election angst and talking about some substantive issues. As you can see, when you look at the City of Madison budget, one major difference is that it relies much more heavily on property taxes to fund core city services. So here you see revenues and spending as proposed for next year from within Madison's general fund, its main set of accounts. And so what you can see is that, you know, for the last couple of years, roughly 3/4 of the revenue has come from just one place, the property tax, which obviously is under limits under state law, as we'll talk about. And some of the other areas of the city revenue, like state aid, and then, you know, during COVID-19, fines, investment incomes, things like that are just either flat or actually down. And so that in turn puts pressure on the spending side. You can see that most of the spending within the city of Madison's budget goes to just a few main areas. So one would obviously be the police department, the other the fire department, public works and transportation and streets, which has a number of areas, but not too many. And then debt service. So you really look at those sort of four big buckets, and that accounts for a pretty large share of your City of Madison general fund spending. And as we can see in the next slide, the city property tax, which is very much its main source of revenue, much more so than for Milwaukee or really almost any other large city in Wisconsin. As that has been limited by the state in recent years, you've seen smaller increases than you would have seen, say, during the 2000s. And under the mayor's proposed budget, the property tax increase would be the lowest since 2003. Would be about what it was in 2015, but it would be the lowest since 2003, which obviously means that there is not going to be, huge increases on the spending side, as we can see in this next slide. So here you can see that, as we talked about in the first slide, most of the new spending increases are going to just a few areas within the city's budget. In particular, the fire and police departments. Now there's a substantial employee raise that's scheduled to take effect in January. That was agreed to by a previous administration. And so that already on the outset puts quite a bit of pressure on the overall budget. Now, the current mayor is seeking to dial back those raises a little bit, as we'll talk about. But out of the gate, when you just look at increases for debt payments and for those contracts, you see a lot of the new spending is spoken for, and that's despite the fact that within the police department, you actually see a small decrease in the number of positions. And all of that together leaves you with a general fund shortfall heading into this budget, and we can talk more about how it's solved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Mayor Rhodes Conway is proposing to close about half of that potential budget gap by drawing down the city's reserves by $8 million. That's obviously a substantial use of the fund balance. What is the significance of that, and what does it mean, Jason, for the city's fiscal condition moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's take a look at the overall shortfall and how it's solved. So you can see that the city heads into this budget cycle with a $16.5 million shortfall. That is closed using a number of tactics. Again, the mayor is seeking these savings within the police and fire contracts. There's other expenditure reductions. But as you can see, a big chunk of the bridge to close the shortfall comes from employee furloughs and an $8 million use of general fund balance. And what's the significance of that? Well, the significance of that is that while you might try to use those tactics going forward, there's only so long that you can rely on drawing down reserves and employee furloughs. So again, one reason that you set aside money for a rainy day is that, for times like now when it's clearly pouring, right? We have a once in 100 years pandemic. We have a major economic challenge. So many might see the use of fund balance as very appropriate in this time. At the same time, it's important to understand that when you use that in one year, it may leave you with greater, or at least not necessarily greater, but at least continued financial challenges in the year to come. So that's something to understand about the budget and how it's structured.
Absolutely. Rob, Jason, our next question is for both of you to respond to. This pandemic has changed so much in 2020, and of course, Milwaukee and Madison are certainly not exempt from that. What are some of the biggest ways in which the pandemic has shaped and influenced these 2021 budgets?
So Mark, I can start. You know, it's interesting because really one of the few bright spots in the mayor's proposed budget for the city of Milwaukee is that the pandemic does not have quite as big a negative impact as had been originally feared. And a big reason for that is the ability of the city to carry over some of the federal coronavirus relief funds that it received in 2020 into 2021. Also, one piece of good news, if there is any, about being so reliant on property taxes and state aids, is that those sources of revenue tend to be more stable in a time of economic recession. And that's what we're seeing here. The impacts to the property tax levy and to state aids won't be felt still for the most part until 2022, though it's still difficult to know what's going to happen in the next state budget. But all that being said, and we can pop a slide up here quickly, there still are impacts from the pandemic for the city budget. What you can see here are 4 relatively small but not insignificant revenue streams that City of Milwaukee relies upon, each of which is taking a major plunge in 2021. And that's a collective impact of about $4.6 million, which is certainly nothing to sneeze at when you have the types of fiscal challenges that Milwaukee has.
Very good, Jason. What are your thoughts about how this relates to Madison?
Well, again, as we talked about, there's a number of hits within the city budget. As we can see in this slide, you're seeing revenues lost in areas like parking, like room taxes, and those tend to support, not only the parking utility, but also on the room tax side, tourism and attractions like Monona Terrace and the Overture Center, Destination Madison, our Convention and Visitors Bureau, and so on. And so again, although in many parts of the budget, this proposal is able to minimize service cuts, there is substantial hits to revenue. There's a substantial use of fund balances, not just in the general fund, but as you can see in some of these other funds. And in certain areas, particularly areas that support tourism and attractions, there have been sort of some ongoing spending cuts and impacts. So, on the one hand, I think maybe things are better than what we would have expected, say, in April or May. Nevertheless, there's a substantial impact in 2020 and 2021, and some of that is likely to linger into the future as well.
Right. While we saw some of these very significant impacts from the pandemic that both of you just detailed, the common theme in both these budgets is really seeing the greater impact emerge from structural budget issues that predated COVID-19. Rob, can you talk about that in relation to Milwaukee? And then Jason, if you would follow with a look at that as it relates to Madison.
Sure, Mark, and this too, it could be a long answer. I'll try to be brief and just boil it down to 2 points. First of all, the fact that shared revenues from the state and property taxes continue to be such a large share of the city's revenue pie and continue to grow on a combined basis at a rate that is well below the rate of inflation. Well, that's a really big ongoing problem. It's been a problem that Milwaukee has faced for over a decade. And now, given the city's very fierce expenditure pressures, it's that much a greater, more serious problem. That dynamic is, as we've said, it plays out again in 2021, and it could even worsen in future years if the state's own budget challenges force cuts in state aids. And then just speaking of fierce expenditure pressures, there's, we can go to the next slide, there's no area where they are greater, of course, than the police budget. As you can see from this slide, prior to the cuts adopted both in 2020 and proposed for 2021, the growth in annual police spending has typically greatly exceeded the growth in the levy and the growth in shared revenue in most years. And again, with this type of needed growth in police spending just to keep pace with the police department's cost to continue, the revenue streams just simply aren't expanding at a pace that allows for that, and that causes some really difficult choices for city leaders.
Very good. Jason, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. So, a couple of things. One, the bad news is that Madison also has a challenge of trying to reconcile its cost increases to continue its current services each year with the new revenues that it's getting from key sources like the property tax and state aid. The good news is, that's like Milwaukee. The good news is, unlike Milwaukee, Madison does not have the kind of substantial unfunded employee pension and retiree healthcare liabilities that the city of Milwaukee has. And so that is a bright spot in Madison's budget, that a lot of its spending pressures still remain more under the control of its elected leaders. And then there is one area that is a concern in terms of long-term liabilities. And as you can see in this slide, it's true that over time, the amount of the city's general fund budget going to debt payments has risen. On the one hand, Madison has relatively high property values, and it has a strong ability to pay the debt that it owes. But on the other side, as that debt service share goes up, it does crowd out spending for other critical services. And that's why it's a point worth watching in the years to
come. To wrap up our segment with the two of you gentlemen, just looking ahead, and maybe if we can give as quick answers as possible here, because we do want to get on to the next segment of our program. But just looking ahead, what are the pressing unresolved challenges for Wisconsin's two biggest cities heading into 2022 and beyond? Rob, would you like to take a stab at that?
Sure, Mark. And there are several big challenges for Milwaukee, but let's quickly focus on just the two biggest, and we'll pop up a slide here. But without question, the challenge posed by the city's skyrocketing pension contribution. I've been with the Wisconsin Policy Forum, formerly the Public Policy Forum, now for 13 years. And this is the single biggest challenge that I have seen facing a local government since I came to the forum. In 2023, as you can see from this slide, the pension contribution is projected to grow to $149 million, which is more than double today's $70 million. It could eat up half of the city's overall property tax levy, and that would just devastate city departments. Unfortunately, the city did have a plan to try to address that when that big spike came, and that was to build up its pension reserve. Unfortunately, because of the challenges in this year's budget, the mayor was able to find $8 million again to add to the reserve, which is the same amount as 2020, but that's far less than the originally hoped for $20 million. And then finally, not to beat a dead horse, but as we discussed earlier, the city's reserves have been really taking a hit, and they are being depleted at the very time they're needed most, given both the economic crisis and the public health crisis. The forum, by the way, is not the only entity worried about that. The city recently saw its bond rating go down by 2 notches per one of the national bond rating agencies. So again, it's sort of this coming together of a bunch of negative forces at one time that is really cause for concern going forward.
Concerning indeed. Jason, let's turn to you. What are the pressing unresolved challenges for Madison heading into 2022 and going forward from there?
Well, I'll just say briefly that Madison has put off some of its key priorities, like trying to roll out bus rapid transit. That's been pushed a little bit into the future. But I'll leave it at that because I want to hear from both President Johnson and President.
Same here. Jason, Rob, thank you both for these insights and just kind of going over our recent research. And with that, I'd like to move to the next phase of our program and introduce our two guests. Cavalier Johnson was first elected in 2016 to represent the 2nd District on Milwaukee's Common Council. He was reelected without opposition in 2020, was also elected by his peers to be council president. And thank you, President Johnson, so much for joining us today.
Great. Thank you, Mark. It's my pleasure to be here joining you and Rob and everybody of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, and as well as President Carter from Madison as well.
Excellent. And Sherry Carter was first elected to the Madison Common Council in 2015. This April, she was elected council president, becoming the first African-American woman to hold that position. And President Carter, it's wonderful to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I want to also thank the Wisconsin Policy Forum, and I'm really happy to be here with President Johnson.
Excellent. Well, let's get this underway here. And President Carter, we're going to start just with a question for you as it relates to the Madison budget. In your view, do you think this Madison proposed budget gets the overall spending priorities correct? Is there any area where you think the city needs to be spending more, or conversely, any area where it needs to cut back?
Right. Well, I think we're not getting everything, obviously, but I do think for the most part that our priorities are in alignment. We are investing in focus interruption, which is a violence prevention organization, and we are also investing in affordable housing. Those two things are paramount.
Okay, very good. Now we're going to kind of alternate between the two council presidents here with the questions, just to keep everybody engaged and on their toes here. So our next question is going to go over to President Johnson as it relates to the Milwaukee city budget. Obviously, we just heard Rob Hinken paint a pretty ominous picture here for the city of Milwaukee in terms of its budget situation. So in your view, President Johnson, where do city leaders and residents need to go from here?
Well, I mean, I think we have to continue to tell the story about how we got here. It was mentioned, in the presentation about how there are state-imposed limits on our ability to raise the revenue necessary from our property taxes in order to take care of our obligations. The presentation also showed that state shared revenue is declining or have been flat for roughly the last 20 years. When there were reforms that the state took on about 10 years ago to pension obligations, those reforms excluded the two largest drivers of our pension woes in Milwaukee. And there's an inability for local governments in Wisconsin, namely, cities like Milwaukee and Madison, Milwaukee particularly being the largest city in the state, to levy a local sales tax on its own that could help to relieve some of the pressures here, as well as provide relief to property taxpayers. We don't have that tool like every other major city in the United States has the ability to do. And it's not because of us, it's because there's a sanction on doing that from state government. So Rob's right. I mean, the situation that we face is dire, but we really need partnership in Madison in order to help us to right the ship.
Okay. Very good. Well, we're going to shift now to talking a little bit about the issue of policing. And of course, that's always a big issue in any municipal budget. 2020, that much bigger of an issue given all the events that have happened in our world here in 2020. And I'm going to direct this next question again to President Carter, and then we'll come back to President Johnson. President Carter, Madison's budget calls for a slight increase in police spending. Now, we heard, of course, Jason Stein talk a little earlier about how some of the contractually required pay increases and other things are playing a role in that. But what is your view about the Madison police budget? Is this spending level, is that the right response in your view to what you heard from all of your constituents and community members in 2020?
Well, I think we have to look at the fact that there are constituents who are going to say we need more police. There are constituents who are going to say we need less police. I think we have to balance those two interests. I think one of the things that in Madison that we need to look at is the annexation of both the town of Madison and the town of Burke, and what strategies that we can implement to provide everyone with public safety. But more importantly, we have to look at innovative ways that our police departments are serving our growing diverse communities. And that's something that I don't feel that we have concentrated on. And that's something that is paramount, especially now in this time, right? So we've had plenty of protests. I'm sure Milwaukee has too. So we have to look at how we can change this. Now, contractual was those contracts were signed by a different administration, and if anyone is aware of contracts with unions, it's very hard to peel that back and say, we promised that, but now we only want to give you this. So we're in a conundrum of that contract. But I do think there are other ways that we can look at this and really serve our community the way they're asking for, both sides.
Okay, very good. We're going to bounce back down to President Johnson regarding the Milwaukee police budget. Of course, we did hear calls both in Madison as well as Milwaukee, calls from activists for whether it's police reform, whether it's potentially defunding police. This Milwaukee budget does actually decrease police spending very slightly, does not really get into any of the sort of deeper, broader reforms or reexamination of the role of policing that some people have talked about and discussed in Milwaukee. President Johnson, are you disappointed by that? Do you see a potential for some of those discussions to take place in the future, or what's kind of your general thought about this police budget?
Well, my general thought is that, over the course of the summer, after the untimely and unfortunate death of Mr. Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis, there have been calls for systemic change, institutional change in policing, not just in Minneapolis, of course, but in Madison, in Milwaukee, and in communities across the United States. And over the summer, the Milwaukee Common Council put forward a number of reforms for policing. From de-escalation to a stated ban on chokeholds to a red flag system. The council's been really busy. But it must be noted, though, that in Wisconsin and certainly in Milwaukee, the city council doesn't have direct oversight of the police department. That's the Fire and Police Commission that has that direct oversight of the police department and its standard operating procedures that guide officer actions. In terms of the sheer dollar amount that goes into the department, it's as President Carter mentioned, it's important to recognize that 95% in Milwaukee, at least, of those dollars are comprised of salaries and benefits. And although police are government employees, like people who pick up your trash or plow your snow or collect your leaves, I guess it's probably more appropriate to mention right now. Those government employees, the police, they have union protections that other employees in Wisconsin simply don't enjoy. Again, going back to the actions of state government 10 years ago, exempting them from Act 10.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I want to shift gears just a bit here and talk about something that was really a huge theme, obviously, in 2020, and that's the area of public health functions that are played by our municipal governments. And in the case of the city of Madison, that's a function that the city of Madison shares with Dane County. In both Madison and Milwaukee for 2021, these proposed budgets do give additional resources to local health departments to continue fighting this pandemic. But meanwhile, something that was really, I think, exposed or brought to light by this pandemic in both of those communities is that we continue to see these huge disparities in health, both in the residents' risks of bad outcomes if they contract COVID-19, but also just in overall health issues. And those disparities are happening, of course, along the lines of both race as well as income. What more can be done at the municipal level about this? Is there anything at the state level that needs to be done? President Carter, we'll start with you, and then I think we'll just kick that same question over to President Johnson when you're done.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the public health department really needs to revisit their strategies on how we address pandemics and health crisis in the future. I think that there is a joint collaboration, obviously, with the state health department and with federal aid, but in many instances, we've been left to fend for ourselves, right? And so I think that we definitely need to start looking at how we are going to address this. As far as how the impact is on our essential workers, if you recall, when we first started out in this pandemic, essential workers were only the doctors and the nurses, et cetera, that were in the hospitals. Essential workers are everyone that you come across at the convenience store and at Walmart, for example, when you're going in there trying to buy your necessary items. We need to have some kind of I don't want to say program, but some kind of path where we are protecting our essential workers. I feel that they have kind of been left out in the cold in this. And I think that because of that, we're seeing the high impact, right? We're seeing more of them going into the hospital. We're seeing more of them catching COVID, whether it's severe or mild. We need to really look at that. I think one thing about the pandemic that has really opened up everybody's eyes is the multiple levels that this COVID has affected society. And now we need to prepare.
And just a quick follow-up, President Carter, when you talk about protecting essential workers, is that through, how would you envision that playing out? Is that ensuring that they have access to the protective equipment, to testing? What exactly do you mean by that?
I think they need to have access to the protective equipment and testing. I think that we need to broaden the definition of essential workers so that these workers are included.
Turning over to you, President Johnson, what are your thoughts on this issue of these disparities that have emerged amid the pandemic?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to note that Milwaukee was, I believe, the first community in the country to declare racism a public health issue. And we see that obviously playing out to your question in terms of the impacts of coronavirus and its impacts on people in terms of their race as well as their income. And speaking of people's race and COVID, Milwaukee was the first, if not one of the first communities in the country as well to start identifying COVID trends and its impact on our neighborhoods and people who live in them based on their race. So we started keeping tabs on who was being hospitalized and who was dying from COVID based on the race of the individuals who were impacted by it. And one of the policies that I think could help to tackle not just this, but other issues relative to health is something that our health department implemented just recently, and that's having a health in all policies approach, something that had been in place in the city of Appleton for some years, led by former Mayor Tim Hanna. I think there are a couple things that could be done in terms of this. Connecting people with family supporting jobs is certainly an area. Not what we've seen, unfortunately, in some communities in Wisconsin, some neighborhoods in Milwaukee, where folks are relegated to working 2 or 3 low-paying jobs in order to make ends meet. If folks have access to high-quality jobs with family-supporting wages, including benefits like healthcare, then folks would be more apt to go to the doctor because it wouldn't be seen as something that could break the bank. So that's certainly at the top of mind. When you have that kind of conversation happening in a place like Milwaukee, it's important to understand that a regional approach to transit is something that would really help to be the lifeline to make that happen for a lot of folks. That's another area where we would need state assistance in order to allow us to move forward something like that. We should continue promoting efforts like we see at G's Clippers here in Milwaukee. It's a barbershop in our city. It's legendary. It's been around for about 20 years. I believe it's actually the largest barbershop in the state of Wisconsin. And in G's Clippers, which primarily African-American men are the clientele, you go in there, there's a wellness aspect. There's a wellness area in there as well that sort of helps to destigmatize, some of those issues and gets people to make sure that they are taking their own health into account. So promoting things like that on the local level, I think would help, not just during a pandemic, but in times just generally. And then on a state and federal level, making sure that people have access to health insurance where, if they don't have, employment that provides that. So on the state level, making sure that folks have access to Badger Care. And on a national level, making sure that you don't get rid of the Affordable Care Act and don't kick 20 million people off of health insurance, especially during a time like a pandemic. I mean, that would be terribly destructive to communities that are already suffering and otherwise don't have access to health care. And so those are some of the ways I think not just the local government, but state government and the federal government can assist with making sure that we beat back some of the tide that we've seen with the impact of COVID, particularly on people of color.
Okay. We are, I think we're going to ask just a couple more questions and then pivot over to the Q&A portion of our program. We are starting to see some questions trickle in from our audience members. Thank you for those who have submitted those. And to other folks who have, questions that you have not yet submitted, I would encourage you to go ahead and get those in. It's helpful to have those kind of in the queue as early as possible. Our last question here for President Carter, relating to Madison. One of Mayor Rhodes Conway's biggest priorities that did have to be delayed, unfortunately, in this budget is the build out of bus rapid transit in Madison. What is your view on where that project stands and where it should be headed, particularly given everything we've seen this year about how the pandemic has affected transit ridership?
Right, and I think that the delay is understandable. I think that what we really need to do is improve the routes we currently have. I think that a lot of our constituents, or at least many of mine, believe that the BRT was only going to benefit those who reside in the isthmus. When it takes you an hour to 2 hours to get to work in a city the size of Madison, something's wrong with our bus system. So I would like to see Metro, along with a lot of the residents of Madison, really improve the routes that are already in existence.
You're good. Last question now for President Johnson. You and other Milwaukee leaders have made the case publicly that state leaders should allow, of course, a voter referendum for city and county government in Milwaukee County to levy a local sales tax. I think you referenced that kind of at the outset of this program. So far, we haven't heard much in the way of a response from state legislative leaders. Why does this matter, and what can be done in your view that might make state leaders revisit this request?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, when you go to a restaurant, it's customary to leave a tip, right? A tip for the services that you received. Milwaukee, I mean, we provide services not just to the residents who are living in our city, but we provide services to folks throughout the metropolitan area. Look, if you're in Milwaukee on a freeway in the morning, you see that they're packed with people coming in from all communities surrounding our city, coming in to work or to do whatever. Their cars, when they get to the city, they exit onto city streets, and that wears on the city's infrastructure. You should leave a tip for that, to help out, because that's not happening the other way. When people drive up from Illinois to see the Bucks and the Bulls play at Pfizer Forum, or to see the Brewers take on the Cubs at Miller Park, they're also beating up on the infrastructure. And if they have a medical emergency, God forbid they do, it's going to be our fire department that is responding. You got to leave a tip for that. When you go to the bars and restaurants downtown, there's going to be people from all across the region and outside of the state even coming to experience the nightlife and the culture in Milwaukee. God forbid they have an incident where they need law enforcement, but if they do, it's Milwaukee police that are responding, and you got to leave a tip for that, because if you don't do that, then it's only left up to taxpayers in the city of Milwaukee to foot the bill on that, even though everybody else is getting some benefit from that. In all these incidents, the onus is on the property taxpayer to pay the costs, and no one else coming into Milwaukee, which is the state's only first-class city, which is the population center, which is the center for density and culture, and the #1 tourist destination in Wisconsin. It's a place where 1/3 of the children live below the poverty line. And we have lead service laterals that are connected to about 70,000 homes. And there are too many people who are unemployed. I mean, if you don't have other people chipping in to pay for these services, then that means all the onus is on people who live here to do that. And if folks would just leave a tip, then we could use some of those resources to take on these other challenges that Milwaukee faces. And I would caution people to understand and see that what happens in Milwaukee is sort of the canary in the coal mine for what's happening in other places too. I mean, the reports that you just show these sort of trends creeping up in Madison, and I would imagine that the same thing would be true down the line in places like Green Bay, Racine, Kenosha, Beloit, and the like. So it's a canary in the coal mine. I just hope and wish that leaders in the Capitol would pay attention to that.
Good. Council President Johnson, Carter, thank you so much for going through these questions. And now I'd like to turn things to our final segment of the program, our Q&A segment. We'll have our President Rob Hankin and our Research Director Jason Stein rejoin us. And some of these questions may just be for one of you. Some of them may go to two or more of you. I'll try to kind of help direct traffic on that front. But we have a lot of questions actually that are coming in that look really great here, and we appreciate everybody submitting them. If you haven't submitted a question, by the way, there's still time to do that. Please go ahead and do that. Here's a question that I'm going to direct over to our President, Rob Hankin. We have somebody here asking, how have city reserves been built up in the past? And Rob, if you could just speak to that as it relates to City of Milwaukee.
Yeah, it's a great question because we saw on that slide. I mean, once upon a time, one of the big factors that sort of distinguished the city of Milwaukee from Milwaukee County in terms of the fiscal challenges. For those who are viewing who are from Milwaukee County, no secret, the county government has faced just these terrible financial challenges dating back all the way to about the year 2000. And the city had largely escaped that. And one of the reasons was that the city was able to build and sustain some real decent sized reserves and was able to make those draws from various reserve funds, most prominently its tax stabilization fund, to really offset any impacts in any individual year when some of these other revenue streams weren't growing or when very special expenditure needs arose. That hasn't happened. And the way those reserves were really built up just a few years ago was healthcare savings. In the wake of Wisconsin Act 10, and no matter what one feels about the merits of Wisconsin Act 10, I don't think there's any question that from a financial standpoint, even notwithstanding the fact that Act 10 does not apply to public safety workers, unionized workers, that various healthcare changes that the city made, not only because of the ability to do so under Act 10, but even some that it was negotiating even prior to that, enabled it to really enjoy healthcare savings over a series of years that built up those reserves, and they were available. And they were helping to really hide some of these impacts that we know have been growing for years, but that now have really taken a very gruesome form, given that those reserves are no longer available.
Very good. Council President Johnson, did you want to weigh in on that, or did you think Rob covered everything there?
No, I think Rob did a pretty decent job of going over that. Yeah, it was mentioned, in the past several budgets that I've been involved with since I've been on the council, that that's where some of our built-in savings were able to come from, and was in terms of our approach to healthcare. So I think Rob did a pretty good job on that.
Great. Now let's shift over to a question relating to Madison. And this one I'm going to direct to Council President Carter, and then Jason Stein, if you'd like to weigh in on it afterward. If you have anything to add, please feel free. This person is just wanting to know, how is the city of Madison investing in affordable housing? Council President Carter, I think I heard you reference that kind of at the outset of your remarks. Can you talk a bit about what the city is doing in this next budget to invest in affordable housing?
Yes, we're putting $5 million into affordable housing. And so what we're really looking at with that is there are developers who specializes in affordable housing. As everyone knows, that the vacancy rate in Madison is very low, and that the rents are very high. So we need affordable housing. And so we put $5 million in it, which is the largest that we've had in that fund. And we're hoping that in the coming years, 21, 22, we will see more developers wanting to build affordable housing. It's very essential.
Thank you for that. Jason Stein, anything you wanted to add to that?
One of the tools that the city has used to be able to make some of those investments that President Carter talked about is by holding open what are known as tax increment finance districts. Essentially, the city can borrow money to make certain investments to spur economic development and pay them off using TID districts. If the city pays off that borrowing ahead of schedule, then they have the option now under state law to leave those districts open and use some of the proceeds for affordable housing. So although that's not necessarily something that the city is guaranteed to have, into the future indefinitely, it's something that the city has enjoyed in recent years and has made use of in that.
And Mark, I would just add that very similarly, that's something that's going on in the city of Milwaukee's 2021 proposed budget, is using some TIFs that would ordinarily have closed down and extending their life. And I think there's about $5 million, despite all of the budget challenges. That's a pretty sizable investment in affordable housing that's happening in Milwaukee again in this budget.
Very good. Here is a question that I think would be a great one to direct to both of our council presidents. This person is saying that there have been several mentions here of 2011 Act 10 and how that law excluded local police and fire from those collective bargaining reforms, which then, of course, as a result of that, excluded the potential budget benefits to the municipalities for police and fire from those. I guess we'll start with you, Council President Johnson, then Council President Carter. This person is wondering, would you support applying those reforms to police and fire, the state applying those reforms also to police and fire departments in order for those budget savings to be realized for your communities?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if those reforms were going to be enacted in the first place, then they should have been fair across the board and asked all government employees, all municipal employees to share in that. So given an opportunity to have police and fire to make contributions like other employees do via Act 10 would be something that I would jump at the opportunity of doing. The problem is that, they haven't been able to do that, or they haven't been doing that rather, for the past 10 years. And even if they started tomorrow, we're still left with a large pension obligation that in the year 2023 is going to double. And going to remain that high for the next several years afterwards. We're looking at a potential minimum of $160 million, up from the $70 million or so that we contribute on an annual basis now. And Rob mentioned that in his presentation that for the past several years in our pension reserve fund, we've tried to save $8 million in order to help with that smoothing. And we've been doing that in preparation for 2023 for the past couple of years, but there's no way that we're going to be able to, with the tools that we have, that we're going to be able to get to the savings that we need. Sorry, the lights are going out in the room here. I guess I've been pretty still, but I'll finish mine. So we would not be able to get to that point in 2023, even with all the savings that we've been putting into our pension reserve fund. And that's just 2023. We still have to worry about 24, 25, 26, and 27. So in order to help future budgets and future pension obligations, I think it'd be important to add them to Act 10. And I'm going to turn the lights on.
Okay, sounds good. We'll let you get through that. We'll direct this one over to Council President Carter and Madison. Would you support having the state apply the Act 10 collective bargaining reforms to police and fire in order for the city of Madison to be able to realize some budget savings from those measures?
Yes, I would. And I have to echo President Johnson. It hasn't happened, right? So I think it'll be difficult to get that passed, and it's very difficult for the fire and police departments to accept. I will say, though, that we have to be very cognizant on the type of contracts we negotiate in the future, because this is, you negotiate a contract you think is fine, but you have to look at the overall budget, right? And how that impacts. So I would hope that if Act 10 doesn't materialize for fire and police, that we would be very careful on the type of contracts that we sign in the future, because it impacts the entire budget. And the next few years are going to be extremely tough for Milwaukee and Madison. And this is a good example on why we have to be extremely careful when we start signing contracts, not only with the police and fire, but signing contracts in general.
Very good. We have here a question also that is directed to both of the council presidents. And I think this is a good one, a little more of a general one. This person is wondering, what have you learned from the pandemic that will apply to your city's preparations for the next crisis, next recession that might come about, the next potentially a public health crisis or other type of crisis. This person is wondering what have you learned from this pandemic that you'll apply going forward. Maybe we'll kick this one over to Council President Johnson first, and then Council President Carter.
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. And I think what this has highlighted is, in terms of our budget preparations for future years, is the need for us to continue to save the best way that we can, cut costs on borrowing the best way that we can. The mayor mentioned in his budget presentation to the council in September that because of borrowing in previous years that was outside of the proposed budget that the council implemented, there was $500,000, $500,000 that had to go towards paying down that debt and interest. This time around, that could have been used for other programs or services. So keeping an eye on that, which I'm certainly in tune with over the past couple of years, including in the coming budget. I've asked for there to be reductions in borrowing. So we need to continue to try to save money where possible, where we can. And I think this should be a call to members serving on city councils, not just in Madison and in Milwaukee, but across the state, that we really have to band together in our efforts to talk to the state government about creating opportunities for us to have more tools in our toolbox to raise the revenue that we need to tackle the issues that we are seeing on the ground in our communities. At the end of the day, you can only do what you can do with the money that you have. And if our ability to raise revenues is constricted, not by our own action, but by state action, then that has a direct impact on our ability to respond to pandemics, to recessions, and the like. So if anything, I think those are the lessons that we're learning out of this.
Good. Council President Carter, what are some of the things that you've learned from the pandemic and the whole ensuing crisis that will apply to preparations for the future?
I agree. Collaboration is the most important. All of the cities, the counties, the villages, the towns, we're all in the same boat right now. As we have to collaborate, we need to come together to actually challenge the state, right? To lift these levies. I think we also have to really, and especially council members, is that we don't need to go up to the 25 cents to the levy. We don't need to borrow a lot. These are things that come to bite us in future years, as we see exactly right now. I think that one of the things that we have to do is also really invest in our public health and invest in those communities that are impacted, regardless of if it's a financial crisis that we go through or a health crisis. The same communities are impacted worse than others. So we definitely need to look at those communities and see what we can do to invest in them. But we have to collaborate. That's my number one thing.
We've had some good questions here. I have one more question here that is directed to Council President Johnson, and then I suppose Rob Henkin, if you'd like to weigh in on it afterward, you're welcome to do so. This person is wondering about, and we heard, of course, the very daunting challenges that Milwaukee faces with its pension contribution. This person is asking specifically if there could be some sort of a change to the city's pension formula in a future budget year to avoid major reductions in the employee base. And I suppose there's different ways that could be done, but Council President Johnson, has there been any consideration of taking a look at the city employee pension formula to try to create some relief for the city on those obligations that it has, or is that something that's been looked at?
Yeah, I mean, there are conversations that are happening that are rolling, because obviously we have a very daunting situation that is approaching us in the next couple of years here. So, I mean, at this point, everything I think is pretty much on the table for consideration. But again, it would be a tremendous help to Milwaukee in future years if the two largest drivers to our pension woes had the same sort of restrictions as every other municipal employee does. It was mentioned in the presentation on Milwaukee's budget that there are 120 police officers that will be losing via attrition in the year 2021. Yet we don't see that large of a savings to the overall departmental budget. And the reason for that, the reason that you see a lower amount of officers, but relatively same amount spent on our budget, is because they do have the opportunity to bargain for wages and benefits and increases like no other employee in the municipal government has the opportunity to do. So again, I think for everybody, not just for police and fire, which the state would have to step in on that, those things are on the table in terms of conversations about what to do in future budget years. Yes.
Very good. Rob, anything that you wanted to add to that, or?
Just very quickly, Mark, because I know we're out of time. So Jason and I actually happened to co-author a report earlier this year looking at the city of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County pension struggles, and they're very, very fierce struggles, and at least pose the question of whether it's time for the city and county of Milwaukee to get folded into the state retirement system. And maybe that's an area where we could see some opening there for collaboration, because in order to do that, state government would really have to play a role in terms of trying to ease the short-term financial impact to the county and the city so that the long-term fiscal benefit might be enjoyed. And at the one legislative hearing that was held on the sales tax proposal that you referenced, Mark, it seemed like while clearly there was sort of a lukewarm attitude toward the notion of a sales tax, there was maybe a more favorable attitude towards somehow having this collaboration and partnership between the state and our two largest local governments to try to fix this pension problem. So maybe there's some room for optimism as we conclude our program today.
We could all use a little bit of that right now. So thank you, Rob. I think we are actually just a couple minutes over, so we are out of time for our Q&A today. But I would first really like to offer a big thank you to our guests, Council President Kevlar Johnson over in Milwaukee, and in Madison, Council President Sherrod Carter. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks as well to Rob Hankin and Jason Stein, and to all of our guests for being with us today. Just a quick heads up, we are going to be sending out a survey to our participants so we can try to improve these presentations and these webinars in the future. Please take a moment if you can to fill that out. And, as the fight against COVID-19, long needed discussions about racial injustice and a very contentious election season continue, the Wisconsin Policy Forum maintains its commitment to providing the highest level of nonpartisan public policy research to inform policymaking in critical areas. Stay tuned for more forum research in the coming weeks, focusing on the state budget, how our state's higher education system can remain competitive, municipal spending, K-12 teacher diversity, and many other topics. And lastly, if you're not a member of the forum, please consider joining our organization. Membership gives you immediate notification when we release a report, special invitations to events like this, and the ability to help shape our research agenda by serving on one of our policy committees. Membership information can be found on our website, wispolicyforum.org. You can also follow the forum on Facebook and Twitter. If you're not already doing so, please sign up. And with that, we are adjourned for today's Forum Friday. Thanks to you all for tuning in. And we hope to see you at our next Forum Friday event. We'll have a date and some details around that event coming out very soon. Thank you all very much.